Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Maritime Dominion and the Triumph of the Free World, Naval Campaigns that Shaped the Modern World, 1852 to 2001, by Peter Padfield, narrated by James Cameron Stewart. Introduction. We, spoiled children of the Enlightenment, are heading for a shock of scarcely imaginable proportions. We are for the squeeze between an inexorably increasing world population and the demand for economic growth to support stable societies in the West and to lift the poorest from poverty in the developing giants, India and China particularly. We are in Thomas Malthus territory, but in the 210 years since Malthus argued that increase of population will always tend to outrun growth of production, we have consumed so many of the Earth's resources that it seems our very survival as a species is at stake. At the least, we will learn, contrary to Genesis chapter 1 verse 28, that God did not create Earth's bounty solely for our enjoyment. What the future holds in war, famine, or pestilence to restore some balance is uncertain. Some thoughts will be found at the end of this volume. In the meantime, here is the story of the Western maritime trading system that has brought us to this pass. It is the final volume in a trilogy begun with maritime supremacy and the opening of the Western mind. That book described the Dutch Republic rising to maritime trading and financial dominance in the 17th century, and Great Britain overtaking her in the 18th century, both at the expense of their larger, more populous rival, France. The second volume, Maritime Power and the Struggle for Freedom, charted the epic final rounds of the contest between Britain and France, and Britain's emergence in the 19th century as supreme trading, financial, and industrial world power. At the heart of both volumes was the opposition between maritime and territorial power as embodied in contrasting types of government and society. Both supreme maritime powers, the Dutch and the British, evolved similar governing forms, characterized as merchant government or government by merchants for merchants. These were unique among states of any consequence, since they could survive only in countries enjoying both access to major sea trading routes and natural barriers against land attack, in the Dutch case a web of waterways and low land which could be flooded, in the British case the English Channel. Without such natural defences, merchant cities fell prey to neighbouring territorial powers. But secure behind their moats, the merchants of Amsterdam and London and other Dutch and British port cities amassed wealth from sea trade and used it to build political power, which they wielded through consultative assemblies to curb the prerogatives of the executive head of state, particularly in matters of finance and taxes. Territorial powers, on the other hand, concerned with the defence or extension of their land borders and the suppression of separatist tendencies within provinces acquired by conquest or dynastic marriage, were dominated by warrior elites whose compulsions provided a very different governing form. All powers were concentrated in the person of the ruler and transmitted through his appointed ministers, a professional bureaucracy, and provincial proconsuls. The aim was to harmonize all regions under a system of uniform regulation and harness the full strength of the people. If local or national consultative assemblies existed, they had been drained of meaningful authority. Taxation and expenditure were the prerogative of the ruler and were directed by his ministers, accountable to him alone. There was no public audit, nor usually a proper government audit. When required, extra finance was raised by extraordinary levies, masked often as voluntary patriotic contributions, levies on conquered populations, the sale of public offices, or loans from financiers secured on the credit of the ruler. Here, the maritime powers had a crucial advantage. Transparency in all matters of taxation and expenditure, combined with the security of private wealth from arbitrary levies, had led to the development of sophisticated financial institutions and, crucially, long-term borrowing. A large part of the extraordinary costs of war was met in this way, spreading the burden to future generations. And since the borrowing formed a national debt guaranteed in the representative assembly of the nation, it commanded the confidence of the moneyed interest at home and abroad, and allowed the maritime powers to borrow at substantially lower rates of interest than territorial powers whose credit was tied to the reputation of the ruler. Finance was always the sinews of war, and since the great wars of the 17th and 18th centuries were essentially armed struggles to extend or defend overseas markets, it is appropriate that they were decided largely on margins of interest. It is scarcely too much to say that for the maritime powers, war was a business venture, their ever-increasing national debt, the debentures for capital necessarily laid out to extend their markets. Cheaper borrowing was not the only factor in the success of the maritime powers. The ability of states enjoying ascendancy at sea to draw resources from all over the world, and in war deny this possibility to the enemy, was equally important. Finally, Britain's triumph over Napoleonic France demonstrated beyond doubt that trade was superior to conquest for the creation of national wealth. This was the vital factor. Plunder was inevitably a diminishing asset, while trade generated both wealth and mutual relationships. Indeed, the 19th century philosopher John Stuart Mill celebrated it as one of the greatest instruments not only of civilization in the narrowest, but of improvements in culture in the widest sense. Brilliant trading city-states shine throughout history, but it was the coalition of trading wealth in nation-states of the size and natural defensive capacity of the Dutch Republic and Great Britain which enabled the trading ethic to gain ascendancy over the martial and spread around the world. And it was this global expansion of trade, stimulating industry, which, for the first time in world history, produced intensive growth, a rise in average income per head, rather than simple economic expansion benefiting elites only. Capitalism and popular consumerism were developed to high levels in the 17th century Dutch Republic, but it was Great Britain in the 19th century which brought these dominant features of the modern West to fruition. As Neil Ferguson has argued, the world we know today is in large measure the product of Britain's age of empire. If this is so for global trade and finance and armed power, it is also true in socio-cultural terms. The essence of the merchant ethic was freedom. The Dutch Republic in the 17th century and Great Britain in the 18th century stood out from continental powers as beacons of intellectual and religious freedoms. Since both were centres of printing and publishing, they were viewed in continental courts that maintained strict control of information and ideas as founts of subversion, as they were. The seismic uprising known as the French Revolution was prepared by ideas that found first expression in the maritime powers. Within the maritime powers, meanwhile, freedom worked to undermine received ideas and class values and shape a more mobile, enterprising, and entrepreneurial society than was possible under the authoritarian regimes of territorial powers. It was the hierarchical rigidity of the French social order and the lack of representative institutions which ensured that the financial difficulties of the French crown in 1788 touched off revolution. Evolution was impossible. By contrast, the fine balancing of authority in the governance of the maritime powers and the democratic influences of commerce and popularly elected institutions positively encouraged change and adaptation. It was not simply trading wealth or naval force which ensured the triumph of maritime over territorial power. It was the fusion of trading, financial, naval, constitutional, and social strengths, each growing from and feeding the others to create a virtuous ascending spiral that carried all before it. During the period covered by this final volume, the United States picked up from Great Britain the baton of maritime and world supremacy, while Germany and Russia replaced France as expressions of territorial power and extreme martial values. Both were humbled. So too was Japan, an island nation rather like Britain, yet imbued with the territorial ethic. The question is whether the opposition of merchant and territorial power, as described in the previous volumes, holds good for this period despite anomalies like Japan. If so, whether it is likely to continue as a universal principle of indefinite duration, or whether, as seems more likely, pollution, damage to ecosystems, and depletion of essential natural resources resulting from the success of the global trading system will force radical change which alters the power equations. This volume begins with Great Britain as the world's only superpower, still grounded in the Christian faith and convinced of an earthly mission to civilize the world. 1. The British Empire. Great Britain's 19th century empire is subject to constant reinterpretation. For those who created and served it, interpretation was hardly necessary. Britain was the fount of moral and material progress, the empire a vehicle for civilizing the world. It was an inspiring conceit, yet it had a solid basis. By replacing human energy with inanimate power sources, Britain's industrial revolution was transforming the terms of existence and expectations. Steam railways and steamships were opening hitherto remote parts of the world. Cheap manufactures were clothing and equipping mass consumers in all regions touched by British trade. Britons themselves were materially better off by reason of the productivity gained by machines. The intellectual foundations were as secure. They were based largely on the economic theories of Adam Smith. In his seminal work on The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, Smith had deplored the high prices and inefficiencies created by national monopolies and protective tariffs on imports, and argued for natural liberty for men and nations to pursue their own interests free of artificial constraints on trade or labour. One of his earliest converts had been William Pitt the Younger, Prime Minister from 1783. Pitt had begun reducing customs duties, but was prevented from continuing by the outbreak of the French Revolutionary War and the consequent need for increased government revenues. Pitt also supported abolition of the slave trade. Adam Smith had argued against slave labour on economic grounds, but for the leaders of the British abolitionist movement and their mass supporters, it was purely a moral issue, and there is no doubt Pitt viewed it as such. He died in 1806. The following year, by coincidence, both the British Parliament and the US Congress had outlawed the slave trade on grounds of moral conviction against powerful vested interests and their own country's economic self-interest. British abolitionists expected other nations to follow their lead. When this did not happen, Britain took it upon herself to force them to do so. It was an extraordinary project, unique in recorded history, since it was driven, like Britain's own renunciation, by philanthropy, not economics. A French historian described it as global moralism. So it was. It had little connection with rational foreign policy, however much French politicians and journalists ascribed it to the British desire to rule the world, and was attended by increasing costs, diplomatic, financial, and in health and lives aboard the warships that were dispatched from 1808 to patrol the slaving coasts of West Africa. The United States was unable to take the same high line. The economy of the southern states, particularly their chief exports of cotton and tobacco, was inextricably bound up with the institution of slavery. Many northern shipowners and financiers were linked to the plantation economy. As a result, virtually no provision was made for enforcing abolition in the United States, and American ships continued the trade illegally. Moreover, such was the sensitivity of the U.S. government to British naval boarding parties searching their ships that the United States ensign became a preferred flag of immunity for slavers of all nations. The French government was equally sensitive to British claims to the right of search, and their position had been upheld by the Admiralty Court in London. Successive British governments had reacted to the difficulties by increasing their efforts with states that could be coerced, particularly Portugal and Spain, and their New World dependencies, Brazil and Cuba. Foremost in the campaign were Pitt's protégés, Lord Castlereagh and George Canning. Both had served in wartime governments and believed, like Pitt, that in leading the coalitions that defeated Napoleon, Britain had saved Europe from tyranny. Both assumed continuing British leadership and held that Britain herself provided the model for Europe and the world. "Let us hope for the interests of mankind," Canning said in 1830, "that all nations will endeavour to introduce that vital spirit, that germ of strength which has enabled so small a country to make such extraordinary exertions to save itself and to deal out salvation to the world." It was in this mind that he and another of Pitt's disciples, William Huskisson, had set out to complete their former chief's work by reducing tariffs on imports and modifying the navigation laws imposed in the 17th century to protect British shipping and assure a reservoir of sailors by reserving imports to British ships or ships of the country of origin. The aim was to increase the volume of international trade by freeing it from restrictions and create, on scientific economic principles, a global division of labour in which countries produced only those goods for which they were best suited by climate and resources. There were several areas where the British commitment to free trade and the abolition of slavery either clashed or merited the charges of hypocrisy that they received regularly from France. A large proportion of the textile manufactures Britain exported worldwide, under the terms of free trade, were made from slave-grown cotton from the southern United States. Similarly, sugar, coffee, and cotton from the slave-worked plantations of Brazil were handled, processed, and sold on by British firms, as was Cuban sugar and tobacco, also produced by slaves. When in 1846 Parliament reduced duties on imported sugar in the cause of free trade, anti-slavery societies raised an outcry demanding the reintroduction of duties on at least the blood-stained sugars of Brazil and Cuba. Lord Palmerston, Foreign Secretary for long periods in the 1830s and 1840s, succeeded in closing down the major market for African slaves in Brazil. He was a passionate abolitionist and pursued his aims with a mixture of diplomatic and financial pressure, monetary inducements, and naval force, on the latter commenting that such half-civilized governments all require a dressing down every 8 or 10 years. Naval action in flagrant violation of Brazilian sovereignty provided the catalyst for his success, but the deeper cause was the penetration of the Brazilian economy by British finance. Since declaring independence from Portugal in 1822, the country had been developed with the aid of British trade and loans, and it was the need to maintain commercial relations and credit with the City of London which underlay Brazil's conversion. Near the close of his life, Palmerston looked back on the ending of the Brazilian slave trade as the achievement which gave him the greatest and purest pleasure. It was appropriate. He had not ended transatlantic slaving altogether, nor the institution of slavery, which continued in the southern United States until the Civil War, and the Spanish colonies of Cuba and Puerto Rico until almost the end of the century, and far beyond in Africa itself, but he had achieved a decisive shift in perspectives. After mid-century, the Atlantic trade was an anomaly, its days clearly numbered. Palmerston's was a principled objection driven by passion. Yet the crusade he, his cabinet colleagues, and their predecessors had sustained was intimately connected with a desire to establish legitimate commerce in Africa and South America. This, in turn, formed part of the drive to extend free trade, and with it British commercial and financial norms around the world. P.J. Kane and A.G. Hopkins, economists of British imperialism, have described this as the world's first comprehensive development programme. It involved exporting the liberal values of individual freedoms and property rights guaranteed by law, free markets, and fiscal and financial disciplines, and carried with it a strong Christianizing and civilizing mission. It was an attempt, again to quote Kane and Hopkins, to reshape the world in Britain's image. Before mid-century, industrialists had been the main supporters and beneficiaries of the drive to free trade. Leading figures in the City of London had not subscribed, believing the increase in imports that would result from cutting tariffs would lead to a drain of gold to pay for them. Despite the realization of their fears in 1846, when Corn Laws, designed to protect British farmers and landowners from foreign competition, were repealed, and wheat from abroad flooded into the country, the momentum to free trade was irresistible, and from 1849 to 1854 the remaining navigation laws were abolished. It had been a bitter struggle. Opponents of the legislation charged the government with abandoning the defence of the nation as shipowners forecast the collapse of the merchant marine, rightly regarded as nursery and reserve of sailors for the Royal Navy in time of war. In truth, the shipping industry had been sapped by protection and needed the prick of competition. In those international trades that had not been reserved to British ships, Americans ruled, their reputation such that British skippers aped the Yankee manner, even adopting a nasal American twang to increase their authority. The collapse of the last redoubts of protectionism in foodstuffs and merchant shipping had coincided with the discovery of gold in California, 1849, and Australia, 1851, and with radical improvements in transport and communications as railways and steamship routes were extended and telegraph cables laid under the sea. The result was a prodigious expansion of international trade and capital flows, and the flowering of what David Kynaston, historian of the City of London, has called the nearest we would ever come to a fully liberal international free trading system. London was the hub, the entrepot, and financial commercial mediator for the world. Comparisons with 17th century Amsterdam are compelling. Like the River Aa then, the Thames was crowded with shipping, and its banks were lined with warehouses filled with commodities from every region of the world. Adjoining streets were hazed with smoke and the scents and smells of a maze of finishing, refining, and manufacturing workshops, interspersed with wholesale and auction rooms and brokers' offices extending to the financial quarter of the city around the Bank of England in Threadneedle Street. The bank was the pivot of the system, as the Exchange Bank of Amsterdam had been 2 centuries before, and for the same reason. It guaranteed the exchange value of the currency. Specifically, the bank maintained the British pound sterling on the gold standard, equivalent in value to a fixed weight of gold. The mechanism was largely self-regulating, charged by law with holding sufficient bullion to back note issues. The bank responded to movements of gold in or out of the country as a result of trading imbalances by adjusting its interest rate, only occasionally intervening directly in the bullion market. Since the bank guaranteed to exchange its notes for the equivalent in gold, and there were no barriers to the movement of gold out of Britain, traders anywhere in the world had the assurance that settlements made in sterling cheques or bills of exchange drawn on London were literally as good as gold. In consequence, sterling had become the major international trading currency, even when there was no commercial link with Great Britain. With the international primacy of sterling, London finance houses had evolved an unrivalled market in short-term commercial credit. Thus, sterling bills of exchange which were accepted, in effect guaranteed, by merchant banks specializing in acceptance business, were readily saleable in the London bill market at a discount off face value. The system lubricated trade worldwide. As it was put in a parliamentary committee report in 1858, "A man in Boston, USA, cannot buy a cargo of tea in Canton without getting a credit from Messrs. Matheson or Messrs. Baring, both London houses, and for this reason many foreign merchants preferred to operate from London itself." The more spectacular role of London's leading merchant banks was the issue of long-term loans to foreign governments. Here Rothschild was the major force, largely because the London house was allied with houses run by family members in Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. Neil Ferguson, latest biographer of this extraordinary clan, suggests that the 5 houses operated in effect as component parts of a multinational bank. The father of the London Bank, Nathan Rothschild, and his main rival, Alexander Baring, had been instrumental in stabilizing Europe after the devastation of Napoleon's wars. Baring had given essential financial support for the British-style constitutional monarchy imposed on France after Waterloo. Rothschild had inaugurated loans for foreign governments designed to be as attractive to investors in the London market as British stock. They were usually more attractive since they carried a higher interest than British government bonds. He achieved this by arranging for interest to be paid in sterling in London, cutting out exchange rate risks, and most significantly, by insisting on more certain security than the word of a sovereign, hitherto the only backing for international lending. By linking loans to constitutional reform and subsequently to fiscal discipline, the Rothschilds, Baring, and others had become powerful instruments of the drive to reshape the world in Britain's image, even more potent perhaps than the Royal Navy, whose worldwide demonstrations of British reach and strength were more immediately obvious. In truth, the City and the Navy were interdependent. The aura of invincibility the Navy had won in the French wars provided the ultimate security for sterling's gold standard. British finance had wrought a similar transformation in the less developed regions outside Europe. The newly emerged states of Latin America were formally independent, but so permeated with British commerce and capital, so constrained by the need to maintain credit in the City of London, that they were in effect dependencies, as Brazil's abrupt renunciation of the slave trade.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?